This screencast will cover selected topics in ecology. This is from chapters 33 through 36. Ecology is the study of how different kinds of organisms interact with one another. It also includes how living organisms interact with their environment. The term ecology was coined from the Greek root words oikos, which means house or home, and logos, which you heard about in my first lecture when I defined biology. Logos means to reason or to study. We might define ecology as the study of home. Also reviewing from Chapter 1, remember a species is a group of individuals similar enough that they're capable of freely interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. We discussed problems with this definition, including interbreeding among closely related species and the inability to use this definition to test the validity of species distinctions in extinct organisms. Populations are composed of many individuals of the same species living in the same area. Population boundaries around non-mobile species may be relatively easy to delineate. However, very mobile species can defy attempts to establish meaningful population boundaries. Communities are composed of many populations of different species living in the same area. Species living in a community share some basic requirements in common. Communities are also shaped by the interactions among individuals, both interspecific, which is between different species, and intraspecific, which is between members of the same species. Interactions are important in determining the composition of the communities. For example, a plant species may not be able to survive in a community that does not also include appropriate pollinators. Ecosystems are composed of one or more communities. What distinguishes a community from an ecosystem is that the concept of community includes only the living organisms, while ecosystems include both the living organisms and their non-living environment. Freshwater ponds, saltwater estuaries, and prairies, to name just a few, are examples of ecosystems. But keep in mind that ecosystems are influenced by their surroundings, and so the entire Earth could be considered a single ecosystem. Let's now look at some characteristics of populations, communities, and ecosystems. Ecologists are often interested in the health of populations, communities, and ecosystems. One measure of how a system is doing is to look at how population size is changing over time. All populations are capable of exponential growth. Ignoring other influences, if the birth rate remains larger than the death rate for a long enough period of time, the population will eventually start increasing rapidly, experiencing exponential growth. Some populations, like bacteria and insects, can reach exponential growth in a few generations, while others, like elephants and whales, may take much longer. Both extremes are capable of exponential growth. It just takes longer for some species. How quickly a population will start growing exponentially depends on factors like age to reach sexual maturity, number of offspring produced in a litter, number of litters possible each year, etc. These factors determine the intrinsic rate of increase for a species, which is abbreviated with the letter R. Populations cannot continue to grow exponentially for extended periods of time because eventually some necessary resource, like food, water, shelter, mates, etc., starts running out. As one or more resources become limiting, the death rate increases and/or the birth rate decreases. Population growth slows and may eventually level off or crash. In long-lived organisms, leveling off of the population size often occurs, resulting in a logistic growth curve. Logistic growth produces an S-shaped curve. With initially few individuals, the population grows slowly at first, then starts increasing rapidly as it approaches exponential growth, and then levels off again as the population size stabilizes. Growth curves like this are common in long-lived organisms, which are inhabiting stable environments. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that an area can support for an extended period of time. K is used to symbolize carrying capacity. Carrying capacity corresponds to the population size at the top of the logistic growth curve, where in an ideal curve, growth equals 0. Carrying capacity is not a single set value. Carrying capacity for species varies from one habitat to another. Carrying capacity also varies with changes in the environment. For example, an increase in rainfall might increase food availability and therefore increase carrying capacity. Let's look at another factor influencing populations: survivorship curves. These curves are used to predict the probability of an individual surviving as a function of their age. There are three generalized patterns seen in survivorship curves. They have the catchy names of Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3. In this graph, we see the three different survivorship curves. These are approximations. No single species matches any one of these exactly. Type 1 survivorship curves are characterized as having low mortality early in life. In other words, most individuals reach maturity. It's not until later in life that the death rate increases sharply. Humans in a country with good health care come closest to having a Type 1 survivorship curve. At the other extreme is Type 3. Here, infant mortality is very high. If an individual does reach adulthood, they have a good chance of reaching old age. Many insects approximate this curve. Between the two extremes is Type 2. Mortality rates remain fairly constant throughout life. Small mammals often have Type 2 survivorship curves. Species strategies don't involve conscious choices made by individuals, but instead refer to life history adaptations which influence how successful species will be under various conditions. While no single species matches either strategy exactly, these are useful generalizations. Remember R, the intrinsic rate of increase? Populations of these species are capable of increasing quickly. K is the symbol that we use for carrying capacity. These populations don't grow as rapidly, but tend to maintain large, stable population sizes for long periods of time. R-selected species are good pioneers. They take advantage of new opportunities. Weeds tend to be R-selected species. They have generally small body sizes. They reach sexual maturity quickly. They specialize in making lots of offspring quickly and dispersing them widely. Rather than putting a lot of effort into parental care, they mass-produce babies and hope that a few find a good place to live. Dandelions and some species of spiders are good examples of R-selected species. In contrast, K-selected species are not good pioneers, but tend to dominate communities when they do finally arrive. They have relatively large body sizes. They mature much more slowly, but tend to live longer. Rather than maximizing the number of offspring produced, they tend to have fewer offspring and invest more time and energy into parental care. Many large mammals and oak trees are nice examples of K-selected species. We'll come back to R and K-selected species when we talk about succession. Still on the topic of populations, let's look at what's happening with the human population. Worldwide, our population is growing at nearly an exponential rate and has been for about 40 years. There's nothing like that in other species. We'll discuss how and why this is occurring in class. This graph illustrates that there's a big difference in growth rates between the richer, more developed, and the poorer, lesser developed countries. The author of this graph predicted that our population wouldn't start to level off until about 2050. Perhaps even more dramatic, this graph I found on Wikipedia shows what has happened to the human population during the last 12,000 years. It wasn't until relatively recently that our population went zooming upwards. Let's look at the age structure typical in richer versus poorer countries. The graph at the top shows the number of individuals of each age group from a country whose population is remaining relatively stable. We see approximately equal numbers at all age groups. Compare that to the bottom graph that represents a rapidly growing population. Here we see the younger individuals greatly outnumber the older age groups. This graph shows the age distribution for the United States. We are shifting from an age distribution with abundant young towards having a more even age distribution. What effect will this have on society? We'll discuss this in class. Let's stop here for the first screencast.